I remember the way the sunlight filtered through the ancient canopy of the Blackwood Forest, creating long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out for my boots as I hiked deeper into the valley. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day solo trek to clear my head, but within the first 4 hours, I realized that the silence of the woods wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like a held breath. The air felt thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something that understood exactly how far I was from the nearest paved road. About 6 miles past the trailhead, I rounded a sharp bend in the path and came face to face with a man standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. He was dressed in a crisp, olive-green Forestry Service uniform, complete with the wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes from the afternoon sun. My initial reaction was one of immense relief, as seeing a ranger usually means safety. But as I got closer, the relief began to curd into a cold, sharp knot in the pit of my stomach. He didn't wave or smile. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, watching me approach with a clinical, unblinking intensity. "Good afternoon, traveler," he said, his voice sounding oddly hollow and rehearsed, as if he were reading from a script he had practiced 1,000 times in a dark room. He told me that the main trail ahead was closed due to a sudden biological hazard involving a chemical spill near the creek, and that I needed to take an unmarked detour through the overgrown ravine to my left. As he spoke, he stepped closer, and that was when I saw it. The silver ranger badge pinned to his chest was crooked, and directly beneath the metal pin, there was a dark, crusty stain of deep crimson blooming across the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't mud, and it certainly wasn't spilled coffee. It was a spray of blood that someone had tried, and failed, to scrub away in a hurry. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my face to remain a mask of casual indifference while my mind raced through every possible exit strategy. "Oh, thanks for the heads up, Ranger," I replied, making sure to keep my voice steady even though my hands were beginning to tremble inside the pockets of my hoodie. I asked him if he had a map of the detour, and as he reached into his pocket, I noticed that his fingernails were caked in fresh, black dirt, the kind you only get from digging deep into the forest floor. He pointed toward a narrow, dark opening in the brush that led straight down into a steep, rocky gorge where the sunlight didn't reach. "It's a shortcut," he whispered, stepping uncomfortably close. "And it's much more private than the main trail, so you won't have to worry about anyone else bothering you down there." The way he said the word private made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that if I followed his directions, I would be walking into a kill zone where no one would ever find my body. I told him I had forgotten my water bottle back at the last rest stone and that I would be right back, turning around before he could object. I didn't run at first because I didn't want him to know that I had seen the blood on his chest, but as soon as I was around the bend, I sprinted into the thickest part of the woods, away from the trail entirely. Night began to fall with a terrifying speed, swallowing the forest in a blanket of obsidian ink that made every tree look like a reaching limb. I crouched behind a massive, fallen cedar tree, pressing my back against the rough bark and trying to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. In the distance, I heard the faint, rhythmic thud of boots hitting the earth, slow, deliberate, and patient. He wasn't running after me because he knew these woods better than I did, and he was simply waiting for me to make a mistake, to snap a twig or heavy breathe my way into his arms. The silence of the night was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl, but then a new sound emerged, the metallic click of a heavy flashlight being switched on. A beam of light began to sweep through the trees, cutting through the darkness like a blade, searching the undergrowth with terrifying precision. I realized that he was using a high-powered tactical light, the kind that could blind a person if it hit them directly in the eyes. I stayed as small as possible, my heart thumping so loudly in my ears that I was sure he could hear it from 20 yards away. "I know you're tired," his voice drifted through the trees, sounding much closer than before. "And the woods are no place for a person to be alone at night without a guide." He was playing a psychological game, trying to sound helpful while he circled my position like a shark in dark water. I watched the light pass over the log I was hiding behind, missing me by only a few inches, and I held my breath until my lungs burned and my vision began to blur. I knew that if I stayed there, he would eventually find me, so I began to crawl on my stomach, dragging myself through the thorns and the mud toward a steep embankment I had seen earlier. Every movement felt like an eternity, and the sound of my jacket rubbing against the leaves seemed like a gunshot in the dead quiet of the deep woods. I reached the edge of the embankment and realized it was a drop-off into a small, fast-moving stream that led toward the park's eastern boundary. I took a deep breath, prayed that the water wasn't too shallow, and let myself slide down the muddy slope, crashing into the icy water with a splash that felt deafening. I didn't stop to check if he heard me. I scrambled to my feet and ran through the waist-deep water, using the sound of the rushing stream to mask my footsteps. I ran until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a pale, gray light over the landscape, and finally, I saw the flickering lights of a highway in the distance. I didn't slow down until my feet hit the asphalt, and I flagged down the first car I saw, a local trucker who looked at my mud-covered, scratched face with genuine horror. As we drove away, I looked back at the tree line and saw a lone figure in an olive-green uniform standing at the edge of the woods, watching the truck disappear into the safety of the morning. He didn't move, he didn't wave. He just stood there with that crooked silver badge gleaming in the early light, waiting for the next hiker who was looking for a shortcut. I reached the police station and told them everything, but when they searched that section of the forest, they found nothing but an empty campsite and a pile of buried hiking gear that didn't belong to me. They never found the man in the uniform, and to this day I can't look at a park ranger without looking at their chest first to see if their badge is straight and their shirt is clean. The woods are beautiful, but I learned the hard way that the most dangerous predators don't have claws or fur. They have uniforms, and they know exactly how to use our trust against us. I have spent my entire life exploring the deepest parts of the Appalachian wilderness, but I never realized that the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't a starving bear or a jagged cliffside. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I decided to veer off the marked trail to follow a dry creek bed that promised a shortcut to a hidden waterfall I had seen on an old topographical map. The air was unusually still, and the usual chatter of squirrels and birds had vanished, replaced by a heavy, artificial silence that made every snap of a dry leaf under my boots sound like a firecracker. I should have turned back when I noticed the fresh tire tracks in the mud, which was impossible because there were no roads for at least 15 miles in any direction. I pushed through a dense thicket of mountain laurel and stopped dead in my tracks as the forest opened up into a perfectly circular, man-made clearing. In the center of the meadow, 3 men in expensive, tailored charcoal suits stood around a large, wooden shipping crate that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of rotting logs and moss. They weren't hunters, and they certainly weren't hikers. They looked like board members who had just stepped out of a high-rise office in the city, except for the tactical holsters visible under their jackets. I froze, hoping my camouflage gear would keep me invisible. But then one of the men looked directly at my hiding spot and tapped a translucent earpiece. "We have an unexpected lot entering the ring," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any human emotion, as he raised a professional-grade tablet to his face. I didn't understand what he meant until I saw the screen of the tablet, which was projecting a live video feed of me standing behind the bush from an angle I couldn't identify. I looked up and saw a small, silent drone hovering just above the tree line, its camera lens tracking my every movement with terrifying precision. One of the other men checked a watch that probably cost more than my house and nodded toward the crate, which began to emit a low, muffled thumping sound from the inside. "The starting bid for the witness is 50,000. The man in the center announced to the empty air, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they were broadcasting this meeting to a private network of buyers. I wasn't just a trespasser anymore. I was a commodity, a piece of evidence that they were selling to the highest bidder right there in the dirt. I turned to bolt back the way I came, but a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the trees behind me, and I realized I was already surrounded by a second team of men dressed in black tactical gear. They didn't move to grab me immediately. They simply stood in a wide circle, pushing me back toward the clearing like cattle being herded into a pen. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of red across the clearing as the auctioneer continued to read numbers off his tablet screen. 100,000. 150. The buyer wants the witness delivered alive to the extraction point at the North Ridge, he stated, his eyes finally meeting mine with a look of predatory satisfaction. I knew that the North Ridge was a sheer cliff face with a small clearing where a helicopter could easily land and disappear without a trace. The sheer clinical nature of the transaction was more terrifying than any physical threat because it meant they didn't see me as a human being with a family and a life. As the darkness of the deep woods began to swallow the clearing, the tactical team started to close the circle, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically on the soft earth. I knew that once they put the zip ties on my wrists, my life was effectively over, and I would become a ghost in a system that didn't exist on any map. I reached into my side pocket and gripped my heavy-duty bear spray, waiting for the exact moment when the auctioneer turned his back to consult with his associates. When the lead guard reached out to grab my shoulder, I didn't scream. I simply pivoted and unleashed a cloud of the stinging orange mist directly into his face. The chaos that followed was my only chance, as the guard shrieked and fell to his knees, clutching his eyes while the others struggled to draw their weapons in the blinding spray. I didn't run back toward the trail because I knew they would be expecting that, so I threw myself down a steep, thorn-covered ravine that led toward a swampy basin. I could hear the drone buzzing overhead like a giant, angry hornet, its thermal camera likely searching for the heat signature of my body against the cold ground. I found a stagnant pool of black water near a fallen oak tree and submerged myself up to my nose, covering my head with thick, stinking mud to mask my thermal print. I laid there for hours, listening to the men move through the brush above me, their voices tight with frustration as they realized their merchandise had vanished into the swamp. The client is not going to be happy about the breach. I heard one of them growl, his voice only a few feet from where I lay shivering in the icy water. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it, and every time a frog splashed or a branch creaked, I expected a bullet to find me in the dark. I stayed perfectly still, ignoring the leeches and the biting insects that crawled across my skin, focusing only on the rhythm of the men's footsteps as they slowly shifted their search toward the higher ground. Around 3 a.m, the sound of a distant helicopter turbine began to whine, echoing through the valley and signaling the arrival of the extraction team. I watched from the shadows of the swamp as the men in suits retreated toward the ridge, their flashlights fading into the distance like dying stars. I waited another 2 hours after the helicopter departed, making sure there were no cleaners left behind to sweep the area for survivors. My muscles were locked in a permanent cramp from the cold, and my clothes were shredded by the briars, but the adrenaline was the only thing keeping me upright as I began the long trek toward the main road. I didn't go to the local police in the small town nearby because I didn't know who might be on the payroll of people who can afford private auctions in the wilderness. Instead, I hiked 20 miles in the opposite direction until I reached a major interstate and flagged down a state trooper patrol car. I told them I had been chased by illegal hunters, keeping the details of the auction to myself until I could get to a federal office in the city. When the authorities finally raided the clearing a week later, they found the wooden crate, but it was empty, and the grass had been neatly mowed to erase any signs of the struggle. I never found out what was inside that crate, and I never want to know what kind of person was on the other end of that tablet bidding on my life. I sold my hiking gear and I haven't stepped foot in the woods since that day, because now I know that the most isolated places on Earth are the perfect offices for the world's most dangerous people. Every time I hear the hum of a drone or see a man in a well-tailored suit, my skin crawls with the memory of that clearing. I escaped the auction, but I know that in some dark corner of the internet, there is still a file with my face on it and a price tag that hasn't been paid yet. I have always been a firm believer that the woods are safer than the city because trees don't have hidden agendas and animals generally leave you alone if you afford them enough respect. As a wildlife photographer, I spend weeks at a time embedded in the deepest parts of the national forest, setting up motion-activated trail cameras to capture the secret lives of mountain lions and black bears that most people only see in magazines. My setup was located in a remote basin that required a 12-hour hike from the nearest fire road, a place so isolated that the silence actually feels like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. I had been camped out in my small, high-altitude tent for 4 days, and the only tracks I had seen in the mud were from a lone buck and a very curious raccoon. On the 5th morning, I woke up feeling a strange sense of unease, a cold prickle on the back of my neck that told me the mountain was no longer as empty as it had been when I arrived. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and made the short trek to the first trail camera I had strapped to a thick hemlock tree about 50 yards from my campsite. I pulled the SD card and popped it into my handheld viewer, expecting to see a few blurry shots of a deer or perhaps the swaying branches of a pine tree triggered by the wind. The first few photos were exactly what I expected, showing the forest floor in the pale, gray light of dusk. But as I scrolled to the images timestamped at 3 o'clock in the morning, my blood turned to ice in my veins. The camera hadn't captured an animal. It had captured a man standing perfectly still in the middle of the frame, staring directly into the lens with a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach his hollow eyes. He was wearing a tattered flannel shirt that looked decades old, and in his right hand he was holding a long, rusted piece of rebar that he used like a walking cane. I scrolled to the next photo, taken only 30 seconds later, and my heart stopped when I realized the man was no longer looking at the camera. He was looking toward the left side of the frame, pointing his rusted metal rod directly at the silhouette of my tent, which was visible in the background under the faint glow of the moon. I felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline as I realized that while I had been dead asleep, a complete stranger had been standing just feet away from me, documenting my location with a terrifying level of patience. I scrolled through the final set of photos, and the last image was a close-up, so detailed that I could see the dirt under the man's fingernails as he reached out to touch the camera lens. He knew exactly where the cameras were, and he knew exactly where I was sleeping, which meant he had been watching me since the moment I stepped off the main trail 5 days ago. I didn't waste a second. I left my heavy cooking gear and my extra supplies behind, grabbing only my pack and my bear spray as I began to move toward the ridge. The sun began to set much faster than I anticipated, and soon the forest was transformed into a maze of long, skeletal shadows that seemed to shift and groan with every gust of wind. I knew I couldn't make it back to the fire road before total darkness hit, so I decided to climb a steep, rocky outcropping where I could put my back against a stone wall and keep a clear line of sight on the trail. As the last bit of light faded from the sky, I heard a sound that made me freeze, the unmistakable, rhythmic clicking of a camera shutter coming from the thick brush below me. It wasn't my camera, and it wasn't a wildlife sensor. It was a manual digital camera, and someone was taking photos of me as I sat shivering on the ledge. I clicked on my high-lumen headlamp and swung the beam toward the sound, catching a flash of flannel and a pair of eyes reflecting the light like a predator in the dark. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mixture of rage and absolute terror that echoed off the canyon walls. There was no verbal response, only the sound of heavy boots scrambling over the loose shale, moving with a speed that suggested the person was intimately familiar with the treacherous terrain. I realized then that he wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, waiting for the darkness to completely strip away my ability to defend myself. I stayed awake for hours, my eyes burning from the strain of staring into the void, listening to the man circle the base of my rocky perch like a wolf waiting for a sheep to stumble. Every time I felt my eyelids grow heavy, I would hear a soft whistle or the sound of a stone being thrown against the rock just a few feet from my head. He wanted me to know that he was there, and he wanted me to know that he was enjoying the process of watching me unravel in the middle of nowhere. I reached into my bag and pulled out my emergency signaling mirror, hoping that if I could catch the light of the moon, I might be able to flash a signal toward the distant observation tower on the next peak. The clouds parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to hit the valley, and I began to flash the SOS signal toward the horizon, praying that the night watchman was looking in my direction. Below me, the clicking sound started again, faster this time, and I realized the man was taking photos of my desperation, capturing the exact moment I realized how helpless I truly was. I decided that I couldn't wait for rescue that might never come, so I tightened my pack and prepared to make a break for the lower creek bed where the terrain was flatter and I could run with more stability. Just as I stood up, I saw a bright, blinding flash of light from the trees directly in front of me. A professional-grade external flash that left purple spots dancing in my vision. I didn't think. I just reacted, leaping off the ledge and sliding down the embankment, using my backpack as a shield against the jagged rocks and the thorns. I could hear him laughing behind me, a dry, wheezing sound that chilled me more than the mountain air, as he began to descend the slope with terrifying agility. I ran blindly through the trees, the branches clawing at my face and arms, until I reached the edge of the rushing creek that marked the boundary of the lower valley. I didn't stop to check the depth. I plunged into the freezing water and waded across, the current pulling at my legs as I struggled to maintain my balance on the slippery stones. On the other side, I didn't look back until I reached the top of the next rise, where I saw the distant, moving lights of a search and rescue team that had seen my mirror flashes from the tower. I sprinted toward them, my lungs screaming for air, until I crashed into the arms of a startled ranger who was leading a small group of volunteers up the trail. I told them about the man, the cameras, and the photos, and they immediately fanned out to search the area where I had been cornered. When they reached my campsite the next morning, my tent had been sliced open from top to bottom, and every single one of my SD cards had been stolen, replaced by a single printed photograph pinned to the hemlock tree. The photograph was a clear, high-resolution shot of me sleeping in my tent from the very first night I arrived, but there was something different about this one compared to the others. In the corner of the photo, a hand was visible, holding a long, sharp blade just inches away from my throat while I slept, proving that he could have ended my life at any moment over the last 5 days. The police searched the entire region for weeks, but they never found the man in the flannel shirt, and they never found his collection of photographs. I never went back for my gear, and I stopped working as a wildlife photographer that very month, because I realized that the most dangerous thing you can find on a trail camera isn't a predator. It's the person who is standing behind the camera, watching you when you think you are completely alone.